Hello everyone, David Huxley here from iCare's mobile engagement team, and I'm joined by Drew Dransfield, who's from the underwriting team at iCare. How are you, Drew?
Yeah, good, Hux. How are you?
Yeah, well, not too bad, not too bad. We'll jump straight into it. Today's webinar is specifically for those New South Wales employers that are growing and may become what is known as an experience rated employer, which is an employer whose average performance premium is greater than $30,000. Now, an employer's premium may increase for a number of reasons. The first is an annual rate increase, where the industry rates are reviewed based on industry performance, but it could also be due to wages increase for an employer due to business growth or perhaps other reasons. So Drew, we've mentioned that today's webinar is for experience rated employers. So let's now go and define what that means exactly. And in New South Wales, there are two predominant categories of employers. Why don't you discuss the difference between the two?
Yeah, thanks, Hux. We'll do. So the majority of the New South Wales employers, about 93% of those are small employers. Now, for the purpose of workers' compensation, these employers have premium that are below 30,000 or equal to as well. And we'll explain how that premium calculation works in a few moments. For the employers who premiums are above 30,000, they are known as experience rated employers and account for about 7% of the New South Wales employer pool. And as the name suggests, any claims experienced in the past 3 years may be used as part of the premium calculation process, depending on the type of claim. The two main differences between the two categories, Hux, is that for small employers, we don't use any of the claims experience in the calculation of the premium, but for the experience rated employers, the ones over 30,000, we may use up to 3 years of previous claims costs at renewal. So that's the main differences there, Hux.
Well, that's right, Drew. And look, speaking of claims, one thing we should note is that employers in both categories, regardless of small or experience rated, may be subject to claims excess if a claim is not reported within 5 days of becoming aware of a workplace injury. So I'll explain that a little more. If a worker advises of an injury today, then the employer has 5 days to report that claim to their claims service provider, just to avoid an excess from being charged. But please note it is 5 calendar days from when the worker notifies their manager or supervisor or perhaps owner of the business. So if the injury occurred, let's just say, Drew, back in April, and then they advise someone today, we'll just say it's mid-June, then the 5 days would start from today, not right back in April. Look, also the Safe Employer Reward, which is shown on the screen, is also available to eligible employers. And what we'll do is we'll explain that criteria shortly in the presentation. But before we get into how premiums are calculated, Drew, why don't you answer one of the most common questions that we receive, and that is, how are the workers' compensation industry rates, or WIC rates, as we refer to them, how are they set exactly?
Yeah, no, right, Hux. So all the WIC rates are assessed every year when we submit our premium filing to CIRA. So the actuaries assess the rate for each WIC or industry using the previous 5 years of claims costs and wages to determine if that rate needs to increase or decrease or stay the same. Basically, they assess if the premium rate as a percentage of wages is sufficient to cover the cost of claims that have been incurred by that industry or sector and the administration of the scheme as well.
So would I be correct in saying the performance of a single employee in a category would indirectly impact the overall rate charged to all employers in that very same category?
Yeah, that's correct. So if enough employers in a category perform better over time, then the overall rate of that industry or WIC may decrease.
Okay. So how exactly do we rate a business, Drew? Many businesses, they will have staff performing different roles, different activities perhaps, and these would vary in terms of risk. Just by way of example, I had my car serviced the other week, and in a mechanics workshop, there were mechanics there on the tools, repairing cars, but there's also administration staff, who sort of took the booking, take the payment, and don't lift more than, say, a pen or maybe the phone. So can we apply a different rate to the administration staff when compared to those mechanics?
Yeah, it's a very common question we get, Hux. So if an employer carries on a single business, the classification applied to the business is that which most accurately describes the entire business of the employer. So the entire business includes not only the operation, so in that scenario, Hux, the mechanic services, but the activities directly involved in the conduct of the business. So the incidental services, such as the office staff there.
Okay, fair enough. So what we'll do now is I'll just update the slide here. What we'll do is I will run the audience through some of the basics of premium calculations. So I'll do this. I'll do the basic stuff, mate. And then when it gets a little bit more complicated, I'll hand back to you to explain.
No worries.
Explain that stuff. That's cool. Yep. All good.
Mate. Go for it.
All right. So on here we can see our small employer, Rick's Restaurant, and Rick pays his staff about. We're just using $1 million here as a figure. That's $1 million in wages to all the staff combined. Now, the current WIC rate for cafes and restaurants from 30th of June 2025 is 2.25%. So therefore, the average performance premium for Rick in this example, just the simple maths of the wages by that rate of 2.25 to give us the average performance premium of $22,500. And that excludes some of the other fees and charges that we're not going to get into today. But in this example, Rick is a small employer. Now, Drew, Rick's doing pretty well for himself, actually. He's got a pretty good product. And what he's done is he's able to open a second store. And that means his wages have doubled. But what happens is the rate remains the same. So I'll run through that now. So the annual wages bill is now $2 million. The WIC rate for cafes and restaurants, 2.25. That's stayed exactly the same. It's the same rate all around New South Wales for all cafes and restaurants, regardless of where you're based or the size of the employer. However, his average performance premium is now $45,000. So as he's above that $30,000 threshold, he's now an experienced rated employer, and his premium will be subject to a claims performance adjustment. But as Rick has not experienced any claims in the 5 years that he has been, operating his businesses, his premium is adjusted, and it's actually brought back to $41,500 or thereabouts. So you can see in this example here, due to Rick's good claims experience, the claims performance adjustment has actually given him a discount. He started at about $45,000 and it's brought back to around $41,000 there. So pretty good news for Rick for having a sort of a safe workplace. But Drew, can I get you to explain the claims performance adjustment and how we calculate that in sort of simple terms?
Yeah, of course. So it's simply 3 years of claims and average performance premium, or APP, prior to the renewal date of the policy period in question. So the 3 prior years of claims costs of the employer is divided by the total average performance premium for the same 3 periods to determine the individual employer's performance, which is then compared to the overall New South Wales scheme performance. To put it even further simply, Hux, if the employer is performing better than the scheme, they will receive a discount, just like that example you showed before. Or on the other side, if it is higher or worse than the overall scheme, then they will be charged more than their average performance premium.
What when we're talking about claims costs, Drew, what many employers probably don't understand is that not all the cost of claims or all the claims costs are used in the premium calculation itself. And actually, really, there's only the one main cost, which we'll go through in a moment. But I'll start with what isn't included, which is excluded from the actual premium. And they're shown on the left-hand side on the screen here. And we've got a number of different costs which are used on a claim, but we don't use in the premium calculation. And I'll just highlight a couple there in yellow, which is the medical expenses. We all know how expensive medical costs can be, especially if someone requires surgery or time in hospital, that type of thing. And again, these costs are not part of the premium calculation. And we move to the bottom of that list there, we've got, transport accommodation costs. Again, sometimes people need to travel to get treatment or to get to, the medical appointments and that type of thing. And sometimes that can be vast distances to people that maybe need to travel around the state or to or the capital city, that type of thing. Again, they're not included. And the last one there is the rehabilitation costs. These are the payments made to a workplace rehabilitation provider who are really they're experts, in not only work health and safety space, but return to work space and the workers' compensation industry space as well. And we'll talk about what their services, what they can do in a moment's time. But we go to the right-hand side, look at the premium impacting costs, and the main one there is the weekly compensation payments. And what that is, that's the payment that's made to a worker when they're off work, so they have no capacity to work, or it could be the payment made to a worker when maybe they do have some capacity to come back to work, to perform light duties or maybe some suitable duties back in the workplace. But as an employer, you can't find anything for them to do. What that means is anything paid to a worker while they're not at work will actually go straight into that premium calculation. And this is where a rehab provider can get involved. So what we encourage employers to do, have a chat to your case manager, the person who may be managing the claim, and just say, hey, I can't find anything for my worker. They do have some capacity to return to work. Chat to the case manager and they may appoint a rehab provider who again is a professional in that space. And again, the costs for the rehab provider services are not included in that premium calculation. And it can actually save you money if we're able to find you some sort of light or suitable duties in your workplace. So we'll move on. And actually, look, speaking of injured workers, I do have a little bit of bad news, as one of Rick's workers, actually his head chef, who's so important to the running of, his restaurant, has injured herself slipping on oil in the kitchen. Now, if Rick reports his claim within 5 days of becoming aware of the injury, he will avoid that excess from being charged, which is equivalent to $1,000, as shown on the screen there, which is 1 week's wage for the worker. So the excess amount is equivalent to the weekly wage for the worker that is injured. So it's always going to be different depending on how much a worker gets paid. Now, Drew, why don't you explain the difference in premium for Rick based on both proactive and a supportive approach to that workplace injury of his chef? And then we'll have a look at what the premium could be if Rick took a bit of a passive approach and was late in reporting the claim and sort of didn't get involved in that process.
Yeah, definitely. No problem, Sux. Thanks for that. So, so if we look at the middle column, so the proactive approach, as you can see there, Rick and his team at the cafe, the restaurant, have worked with the head chef to get them back to some sort of return to work. So engaging a rehab provider, they've kept the wage cost really at a minimum, so the $2,500 there. You can see there that the base premium, compared to his average performance premium, which without claims was around $45,000, keeping that at a minimum has helped reduce that premium by the base premium by $2,000 roughly. So he's kept that at a minimum. If we look at the passive approach where there's no real involvement by Rick or any sort of rehabilitation provider or someone else from the business, unfortunately the head chef has had some more time off by the looks of it, and they've incurred nearly $10,000 worth of wage costs. So that has actually added on to his average performance premium, meaning that there's roughly about a $14,000 increase on that premium payable or charged based on the delayed or the passive approach in terms of return to work. So Hux, I guess just to simplify that even further or clarify that, not only does getting the worker back to work quicker and providing suitable or light duties, as some might call it when possible, support a speedier recovery, but it can also save a cost to the business. And it's proven that having an employee or a worker back at work amongst their colleagues and work friends, that it's a much healthier place for them to be. Obviously, once it's safe, and it helps them with the sustained return to work as well. So, Hux, this slide sort of mentioned some direct impacts for Rick from the two different approaches, but there's also other potential indirect costs for any business that may experience a workplace injury. Can you run through a couple of the main ones?
Yeah. Thanks, Drew. I've just brought them up here on the screen, and
Thanks.
clearly, a head chef is a pretty integral part of a business in the example that we're using. But there's going to be the loss of productivity when you're missing staff. There's less people to produce whatever it is you're there to produce. So that's the number one sort of impact there. Clearly, there's going to be time, effort, and resources perhaps to find ways to backfill that position there. And sometimes that can mean that other staff that are working in the business may have to do a little bit more, cover that extra shift, do extra days, which can impact on their own engagement or workplace culture. But also, staff are, when they're aware of a workplace injury, and they actually can observe how the employer responds to that. And if the employer responds poorly, again, that can impact on workplace culture as well. Now, business reputation is another risk potentially, especially we mentioned the head chef responsible for probably making sure all the service and the quality of the product that's being produced is spot on. If they're missing, again, there can be business reputational risks there. We kind of referenced earlier on that every employer does contribute to the overall industry rate or WIC rate. So, if everyone's performance does sort of tie into what's charged there for that 5-year sort of capture of claims versus premium charge for individual industry rates. Obviously, any additional premium charged due to having a workplace claim means there'll be business cash flow impacts potentially. And of course, added anxiety, you're already running a business, running staff, that type of thing. There's enough pressures there, but then you've got the workers' compensation matter as well to sort of look after. So, yeah, certainly a number of things there, Drew. But really, look, over the years, I've spoken to so many employers that maybe delay in reporting a claim or don't report a claim for one of many reasons. That maybe they just don't know what to do. But by not reporting a claim, it's actually against legislation. You do have a requirement to report every single workers' compensation, workplace injury where someone has taken time off from work or required paid medical treatment. And if you don't report them, as soon as you possibly can, it can sometimes result in a delay in that worker getting the treatment that they need, which means it could be a delay. Which means their injury could actually get worse over time, which then flows onto a delay in a return to work. The worker may be out of pocket. They've got to pay for the medical expenses themselves when really they shouldn't. They can claim under the workers' compensation policy. And they may have to take sick leave or perhaps annual leave when they really shouldn't. There's an entitlement, once again, under the legislation for workers who are injured at work to take workers' compensation leave. So just to reinforce that point, Drew, if you are an employer, you are required to report injury by law, and doing so as early as possible allows for treatment to commence so the worker can recover quicker and return to work planning to begin. So let's talk about a few savings here, Drew. So find some ways employers can maybe save some money in their premiums. So the first one is a payment option here. So just want to explain that for us.
Yeah, definitely, Huck. So this one's pretty straightforward. So in regards to renewal premium payments, if an employer does select to pay it in full within 30 days of us issuing the premium, they'll actually receive a 3% discount off the premium. So it's an initial saving straight off the bat, which is a good start. Yeah.
Yeah, and
so if we look at sort of Rick's premium,
mate.
You're right. So if we look at Rick's premium, he's already saving just over $1,300 just by paying that in full.
Mm-hmm. And the great thing is that, look, there's a fair bit to pay up front. I understand that. But if you do decide to pay your premium by installments, we do offer that. For anyone who has a premium over $1,000. We offer monthly installments, but we're not going to charge you any more. So I know that recently I renewed my house insurance, Drew, and it had gone up quite a bit. So I elected to pay by installments, and they'd loaded it by 5% on top of my normal sort of annual premium for paying by installments. But we won't do that. Pay by installments. We're not going to charge you anymore. If you can pay it in full, you get a 3% discount. So it's not a bad little saving, little incentive there. But listen, Drew, we mentioned this Safe Employer Reward a little earlier on. Just want to explain what that is and how to qualify for that.
Yeah, thanks, Huck. So as you can see there, so in terms of what will qualify a business or an employer for that, they must at least have 3 years of a policy history. no catastrophic claims within the last 36 months prior to the renewal, and their claims performance rate has to be less than 100 or below, 100%. And as you can see there is a sliding scale in terms of the eligibility or the amount they can actually receive, depending on how good their performance rate is. So you can see there it's a sliding scale of 0 to 20%, all the way up to 50 to 100%. In terms of the Safe Employer Award as a concept or as an option, so it's a reduction to the premium for those employers who are performing better than the New South Wales scheme. So we mentioned that a little bit earlier. And as long as they're meeting those eligibility points or performance points, they'll be able to achieve that award.
Right, and you can see there for Rick, if he had no claims, which he didn't up until that slip in the kitchen, 7.5% off his premium is about $3,375. So not a bad little saving there. And look, Drew, a lot of people actually ask, and you probably get this as well. How do we obtain the Safe Employer Award? Well, I'll just let you know it's automatically calculated, and it should be in your renewal notice when you receive that each year if you are eligible there as well. So we'll move on. So Drew, we looked at the premium examples there earlier on, and looked at the premium savings for Rick's Restaurant for being supportive, and looking after that injured worker with early reporting and return to work. But what we haven't mentioned is also another incentive there to lower the cost of each individual claim for supporting return to work, the return to work incentive. Just want to explain that one?
Yeah, no problem, Huck. So the return to work incentive, it's another incentive or award in place to encourage early and sustainable return to work. This encourages reduced time lost and obviously potentially an impact on the employer's premium. So to elaborate a little further in conjunction with that slide or the imagery that you Hucks, so if an employee comes back to work on a sustained return to work for 3 months with no wage loss or wage reimbursement within the first 13 weeks, they'll actually get a 15% reduction on their individual claims cost, impacting claims costs. Obviously, the 3 months might go over that period, but the first time they come back to work must be within that 13 weeks. And then you can see there is a sliding scale. So the next bracket would be the 13 to 26 weeks. They come back to work within that time frame. There's a 10% reduction on the individual claims cost, and therefore flowing into the next bracket, which is the 26 to 52 weeks, there's a 5% reduction. So essentially the impacting cost of an individual claim is reduced by the associated return to work incentive if they meet those criteria. So Hux, there's a lot of reasons to report a claim as soon as possible, as we've mentioned a few times.
Yep.
And we've discussed a few direct financial savings. But there are also some potential business savings also. Is that something you can go into?
Yes, mate. Yes, I'll just get that ready here. Now, look, this little chart here is a snapshot of the New South Wales scheme, and what we're looking at here is the difference between reporting a claim in 5 days of becoming aware and outside of 5 days. And the little dial shows that 59% of all claims across all of New South Wales, on average, are reported within 5 days. So still a bit of work to be done, with over 40% not reported within 5 days. And the difference being, which is shown on the right-hand side, with regards to time off. So for those reported inside 5 days, the average claims duration or time away from work is 64 days, but the average duration for those reported outside of 5 days is much greater at 141 days. And look, when that translates to cost to claim, you can see that the average cost is $33,000 for claims reported within 5 days, and as much as $58,000 on average for those reported outside of 5 days. So really, they report your claim within 5 days, and on average across the state, workers are getting back 77 days quicker. Claims costs are saving $25,000, which can flow into your premium as well, and will save you from being charged in excess along the way. So lots and lots of reasons, as we were discussing, to report a claim as soon as you possibly can. So before we wrap the session up, Drew, can you just quickly discuss the apprentice discount and how employers can actually access that?
Yeah, definitely, Huck. So under the New South Wales Workers' Compensation Scheme, there is an apprentice incentive. So it's another opportunity for a reduction on the premium as well. So if you do employ apprentices under registered apprenticeships, you can actually you declare their wages separately, or declare them aside from your direct workers or your other employees, and you'll actually receive a discount based on their wages to the premium calculation. So there's another reduction there straight away.
Fantastic. Now, speaking of declaring wages, let's quickly touch on why it is important.
Yeah, definitely. So it's really important, obviously, that employers in New South Wales declare their wages, being the actual wages at the end of a policy period. Make sure you're paying the correct premium. And sometimes your wages will be less than what the policy was renewed on. So you actually be entitled to a refund, Huck. So by delaying submissions of actual wages, you're potentially holding up a refund back to your business. Obviously, for those experience rated employees, it means that, as we touched on earlier in the presentation, that we're using the historical data for some of the claims experience evaluations. Having up-to-date and accurate actual wages from prior periods ensures that we are reviewing and issuing the correct premiums. Sorry, you go.
No, I was going to say one more thing there is if we're not declaring our wages on time, in future, employers may be actually charged at 30% more loading on future renewals. And one thing coming in next year, Drew, which is the last point there, is that safe employer reward, which you were talking about a little earlier. If you're not completing your wage declarations, then you may lose that in future. So really important, Drew, that we do our wage declarations there. So,
definitely.
Yeah. So what we're going to, you go, mate.
No, I was going to say we've spoken a lot about the workplace injuries and encourage reporting of claims. So have you got a quick run through, Hux, of what an employer should be doing if a worker injures themselves at work?
Yeah, just quickly. Perfect. Yeah, we'll just run this from top to bottom. The diagram there is similar to the 1 to 7, but really, you know, if you become aware of an injury, obviously support the worker, apply first aid, or anyone else who may be involved in that incident. Look, we mentioned 5 days is the excess charge. We actually have a requirement under legislation to report a claim within 48 hours of becoming aware. But do report it within 5 days and you'll actually avoid being charged that additional excess as well. That is the current rules for excess, which could change over time. Support the worker with any medical appointments, visits to the doctor, or any other treatment needs. You've got to provide what's known as the PAOE, the pre-injury average weekly earnings, which is basically the wage entitlement for the worker whilst they're off work. And as employers, you also have an obligation to sort of assist in the development of that return to work plan to get that worker back to work, because it's proven that return to work is part of that recovery process. And point 6 there is that basically the worker does recover quicker when they're back at work. And also you'll have sort of less impacts for your business if you get back the worker as soon as you possibly can. Complete a risk assessment if there was an incident. Why did it happen? How did it happen? And just to eliminate sort of those future incidents in the future. And the last point there on the bottom of the screen is that, look, even if a worker isn't at work, they're off at home, maybe on a workers' compensation claim, look, they still exist. So it's really important that you do keep that connection alive, check in on them, because sometimes they might be sitting at home feeling guilty or judged by others, you know, in the workplace there. So, and it's proven that a worker that feels connected to the workplace returns to work quicker. Look, I think we're just about the last slide here, Drew. I'm just going to wrap up the key points, if you like, from today's session here. We'll just run through it quickly. So, look, if your premium is above $30,000, you are an experience-rated employer, and up to 3 years' worth of claims experience may be used in that premium calculation. Now, report your claim within 5 days of being notified of the injury to receive a much quicker return to work, up to 77 days quicker on average across the state, but also save up to $25,000 on average per cost on individual claims, which is pretty significant when we look at what that can do to your premium. Also, report within 5 days and you'll avoid being charged that excess. Look, embed a return to work culture back in your workplace, support your workers with recovery work. Again, workers tend to recover a lot quicker when they are back in the workplace. And if they're not, stay connected with that worker to, again, speed up those return to work timeframes. If you can, pay your premium in full and receive the full 3% discount in your policy and your premium charged. Don't forget to declare your apprentice wages separately on the form because they are discounted out of your premium. And you will receive that 7.5% discount, that Safe Employer Award, if you do meet the criteria, and that'll come through on your premium notice there. So final point is, if you do have an injury, support return to work because the wages paid to any workers off work have the greatest impact on the overall cost of claims. Drew, I think we've come to the end of our session there. So hopefully we've supported and assisted and provided some information to our experience-rated employers in how they can perhaps sort of reduce the impact of any claims and maybe find some ways to save some premium along the way as well. So thanks again, Drew. Look forward to catching up with you in the future, and maybe we can host a few more sessions, mate.
That's good. Thanks, Hux.
All right. Thanks very much.